Well, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the role of land in the expansion. After all, it was the opportunity and the desire for rich lands, the desire really for free lands that drove people out west. And they weren't free in the sense that you didn't have to pay for them. They weren't free in the sense that they didn't have laws that applied to them, but they were free in the sense there was an incredible amount of liberty, an incredible amount of independence. You were able to make your own decisions. You actually had to establish your own infrastructure and establish an own form of justice. And it's amazing that this actually occurred. But you have to understand, too, when we look at land, that land has always been something that has been valuable to man. After all, we were made for the garden. We were made to actually work that garden and create that garden to expand or cause it to expand. We were also made, as you see with Jefferson, to be cultivators of the earth. And cultivators of the earth are some people who actually value the land to such a degree that they will defend it highly. And so this whole connection to the land, something that created something like nostalgia we talked about earlier in the Civil War, shows you how men work. It shows you the fact that we actually need green things. In fact, the Soviets had to learn this the hard way. They often created cities that were so full of concrete and modern technological innovations that they neglected to install things like grassy parks or trees. And as a result, people became depressed and often took their own lives. In other words, the Soviets realized that they had to install green spaces, which is why if you go to any nice modern city, you go to a place like New York City, or you go to London, they are full of green parks. It's a part of who we are. It's a part of what we actually desire. Well, land was really one of the primary means for population growth in the early United States. But it was always based upon some kind of simple family life. In fact, let me read to you how it was typical in the way that the population grew. This was said by an unnamed congressman, but recorded by Paul Johnson. He says, "I invite you to go west and visit one of our log cabins." So take yourself back to, say, the 1830s. Imagine that you're going into a log cabin, say, in rural Ohio or rural Indiana. And he says, "Number its inmates there. There you will find a strong, stout youth of 18 with his better half," so he's newly married, "just commencing the first struggle of independent life. 30 years from that time, visit them again. And instead of 2 people, you will find in that same family 22 people. That is what I call the American multiplication table." And in fact, it was rather true. The population doubled in the first 20 years of the 19th century. And the large reason that it doubled was because there was such opportunity of independence, and it doubled largely from the people who were already here having an incredible number of children. A lot of this began because the land was available cheaply. In fact, if you went over the mountains to, say, the Northwest at that time, which was the Ohio country, or if you cross over into Kentucky or Tennessee or Alabama, for example, in many of those regions, you could acquire land for only $2 an acre, which was cheap even back then for land. In fact, for $2 an acre, you could get up to 320 acres, and you could do all of this for only 25% down. So that meant with a mere $160, you could establish a fairly large farm. Of course, the deal was you would have to clear that land yourself. It often was full of forest. And it's one thing to cut down trees, it's another thing to actually remove stumps from the land. But still, this was what the axe and the plow accomplished, and it created the Midlands. It created the Midwest as we know it to this day. In fact, in the first 10 years of the 19th century, of the 1800s that is, some 3 million acres in the Northwest were sold in this manner. In Alabama alone, there were another 3 million acres sold by the year 1819. And then to make things even sweeter, the federal land offices dropped the price of land from $2 an acre to only $1.25. After that, they then created some 40 U.S. land offices which provided detailed land surveys. They actually came from the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And these land surveys would tell you everything from the condition of the soil to the nearest body of water, such as fresh water that you would need for crops and livestock, to the local geology finds, to any finds of oil, etc. So it provided a wealth of information, and it was all available cheaply. The thing was that the U.S. government promised you no improvements. They promised you no roads. They promised you no utilities, no bridges or canals, not even in many cases an actual local police force or court system or school. And so the settlers were the ones who made those things. It was the settlers who built the roads, who constructed the bridges, who established the courts and the churches and the schools, and then maintained them and repaired them. But all of this shows an incredible opportunity. In fact, Paul Johnson has this to say. He says, more people acquired freehold land with no mortgage. They acquired it outright. They paid cash for it at bargain prices in the United States at this time than in any other time in the history of the world. In other words, we could look at the rest of world history and would be hard-pressed to find another opportunity in all of the world's history throughout the many centuries in which land was available so easily to so many from such a wide variety of backgrounds. But not only that, but this land, even though it needed to be cleared, it was rich in soil. The dirt itself had so many nutrients that it was often black, especially in places like Illinois. And so the settlers, when they came and they cleared this land, they found that they could have incredible production off of it. For example, consider one family. They were known as the Ten Broek family. So they came from a Dutch background. And they settled in Park County, Indiana, with only 27 people and some livestock, as well as the various tools and furniture implements that they could bring with them. Well, after one single year, they had built a modest cabin, large enough to sleep all 27, but probably not large enough for them to move around much. They had only cleared 15 acres. So even with 27 people, it shows you how difficult and how long it took to clear this acreage. But on those 15 acres, after the first year's production and farming, they had produced 100 bushels of corn, 100 bushels of potatoes, 100 bushels of turnips, as well as seeing 7 new calves birthed, created 40 12-pound cheeses, harvested some 350 pounds of sugar, and able to acquire 10 gallons of molasses. In other words, this kind of production and this kind of fruitfulness caused the number of farms to triple within the first 50 years of the 19th century. It was an incredible opportunity for anyone who came over here or anyone who was living on the East Coast who no longer saw widely available lands. As a result, it created states rapidly. In 1792, Kentucky was established as a state. In 1796, Tennessee. In 1803 came Ohio. Louisiana came in 1812, followed by Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, the following year, Illinois and Alabama in 1819, Missouri in 1821, Arkansas in 1836, and Michigan in 1837. That's 11 states created in just 40 years. That's 11 states created in what is roughly a single generation of people. That's an astonishing growth. As a result of this, cities also began to grow. In fact, in 1810, only some 7% of all the population of the United States lived in cities. But by 1850, it would be some 30%. And that's because wherever great towns were established, almost always on some well-known traveled river or some river that provided great resources and, of course, fresh water to the local population, there would always spring up churches, followed by schools, and then followed curiously by newspapers. In fact, the whole idea of the free press, the whole idea of people being well informed about what was going on in their community, what was going on in their nation, and even the world, was always an idea that went with Americans wherever they went. It was this whole idea that you need to be able to correctly apply the knowledge of the world, which means you have to have the knowledge of the world in the first place. They, of course, were then followed by the merchants who set up stores in these successful towns, and then were followed by the bankers, and eventually the lawyers, and established courts. All of these things can be seen in a city like Indianapolis, which in 1821 was founded with just a few families, but 6 years later had 1,000 people with 1,000 cleared acres, some 10 stores, some 6 pubs, a beautiful courthouse, and many fine 2-story houses. Those kind of stories of these towns springing up so quickly became common. They became common throughout the Midwest and show the remarkable industry that the people who were settling these towns had because they had a remarkable opportunity. A lot of this grew because of the high birth rates, but it also grew because of steady immigration. After all, there were people coming from Ireland and Germany, particularly in the 1840s, who saw this opportunity to finally own land that they could farm, whereas in the past, in Europe, they had largely farmed land that belonged to another. In fact, by 1850, the typical farmer who came from Europe and came over here as an immigrant could work for another farmer already established here in the U.S. in one of our states, and over a single year's time, he could save up enough money to move west and buy his own 80-acre farm. He was able to save enough money to buy an acre and a half every single week. That's a remarkable and singular opportunity, and an opportunity that was wisely taken by many in this day and age. That's what drove that whole early expansion. It was the axe and the plow, as Almanzo Wilder's father did indeed say.